I came home from a one-week training trip and found out my neighbor had built a balcony over my backyard. Not near it, not up to the line over it like my property was some kind of clerical error. And the wildest part wasn't even the wood or the concrete. It was the look on his face when I asked about it, like I was the one being weird. I bought my house in 2018 just outside Columbus, Ohio, and nobody would have called it impressive. Beige siding, old roof deck boards that squeaked like they were filing complaints every time I stepped on them. The house itself was just fine, but the backyard, that was the thing that got me. Deep lot, deeper than most in the neighborhood, 3 sides fenced, and right in the middle of it stood this big old maple tree that threw a wide patch of shade every summer. It had the kind of yard that made you breathe different. You could sit out there with a beer at night and hear crickets instead of traffic. And after getting back from an overseas rotation with the National Guard, that mattered to me more than I knew how to explain. I didn't want flashy, I didn't want trendy, I didn't want some giant open concept monument to bad decisions. I wanted peace. I wanted a place that felt like mine. For a while, that's exactly what I had. The house behind mine belonged to a retired couple when I first moved in. Quiet people, the kind of neighbors everybody hopes for. They had a little ranch house and a garden so neat it almost looked fake. When they moved, the place sat empty for a couple months. Then one morning, a black pickup rolled up towing a construction trailer. And not long after that, I met the new owners, Travis and Lindsay Carter. At first, they seemed normal enough. Travis had that fast-talking, high-energy vibe, like every sentence was halfway to becoming a sales pitch. Lindsay was more polished, always looked put together, always moved like she was already late for something important. One afternoon, Travis called over the fence while I was trimming the maple and said, "Hey man, just wanted to give you a heads up, we're probably tearing this place down." I looked over and said, "You mean remodeling?" He grinned and said, "Nope, full rebuild. We're doing our forever home." He said forever home the way some people talk about Holy Scripture. I told him good luck. I didn't love the idea of a construction site behind my yard for months, but it wasn't my property. And around there, people rebuilt houses all the time. I figured it'd be loud, then it'd be over, then life would settle down again. That was mistake number 1. About 2 months later, the old house was gone, flattened into a dirt lot with a temporary chain fence around it. Then the framing started, and every morning at 7 sharp, the whole place came alive with nail guns shouting, idling trucks, dumpsters half blocking the street. Ladders leaned against my mailbox post like it was public equipment. Nothing huge on its own, just a steady drip of small annoyances that wears a man down if you let it. I kept my mouth shut because construction is temporary, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. As the new house went up, I started noticing the backside of it had huge windows, floor-to-ceiling glass facing straight toward my yard. One evening, I was standing on my deck with my neighbor Dave from across the street, and he squinted at the framing and said, "That is a whole lot of window pointed at your place." I laughed and said, "Maybe they really like trees." But I already knew what he meant. Privacy in the suburbs is this fragile little agreement nobody says out loud. Everybody technically has their own space, but one bad design choice and suddenly somebody's living room is looking straight into your bedroom. Still, windows are windows. People can use blinds. I wasn't about to start a feud over architecture. By late summer, the house was nearly done. White siding, black trim, that modern farmhouse look people got obsessed with for a while. Clean, sharp, expensive looking. On the backside, there was a second-story living area with sliding glass doors. At that point, it was just doors, nothing attached to them. No deck, no balcony, no structure hanging into the air. Then in October, I had to leave for a week for guard training in Missouri. Routine stuff. Nothing dramatic. I locked up the house, asked Dave to keep an eye on things, and figured when I got back the job would probably be finished. In a way, it was. I pulled into my driveway that Sunday afternoon, dragged my suitcase through the side gate, stepped into my backyard, and the first thing I noticed was the shadow. This long, hard-edged rectangle stretched across my lawn where the sunlight used to hit. I looked up, and there it was, a brand new second-story balcony hanging off the back of the Carter house. And when I say hanging over my yard, I mean exactly that. Not close, not maybe. Over it. The whole structure extended past their fence line, and one of the support posts was planted squarely inside my property. On top of that, half the branches on one side of my maple had been cut clean off to make room for it, just laying there in the grass like the tree had volunteered for surgery. I remember standing there with my mouth half open, staring up at this thing, feeling that slow kind of anger that doesn't come in a burst. It settles in. Heavy. Quiet. The kind that tells you somebody looked at a boundary and decided it didn't apply to them. I walked to their back gate and knocked once. A A second later, the sliding door opened upstairs and Travis stepped out onto the brand new balcony, smiling down at me like we were just two neighbors admiring a sunset. "Hey man," he said, leaning on the railing, "you just get back?" I looked up at him and said, "Yeah, just got in." He tapped the railing like he was showing off a new boat. "What do you think?" That question just hung there for a second. I looked at the beams, then at the post in my yard, then back up at him. "What do I think about what?" He chuckled. "The balcony." I said, "Why is your balcony over my backyard?" His smile didn't disappear, but it stumbled a little. Just a flicker. Then he shrugged and said, "It's just airspace." He said it so casually you'd think he was explaining weather. It's just airspace. Like the sky over my property had somehow become shared custody. I pointed at the support post and said, "That beam is in my yard." He glanced down and waved a hand. "Contractor handled all that." Now, I don't know about you, but anytime somebody says the contractor handled it, what I hear is something went sideways and I'd rather not discuss it. I said, "My tree's been cut." He leaned over the railing and looked at the branches like he was noticing them for the first time. "Oh yeah, they had to clear some space for the deck line." Deck line. He said it like it was a law of nature. I took a breath and asked, "Did anybody ask me about that?" He scratched the back of his neck and said, "I figured it'd be fine." That was the moment something clicked for me. He didn't think this was a problem. He thought it was done. Settled. Like if you build something big enough and confidently enough, other people will just adjust their lives around it. I didn't argue, I just said, "I'm going to check my survey." He nodded like we were discussing fertilizer and stepped back inside. I went into my house, pulled out the folder with all my closing documents, found the land survey, and walked back outside with a tape measure. I measured from the fence from the corner marker I had installed when I built my fence years earlier from every point that mattered. The balcony wasn't barely over the line. It hung almost 3 feet into my yard, and that support post sat a little over 2 feet inside my property. I took photos, measured again, took more photos. Dave wandered over while I was out there and stopped dead when he saw it. "Holy hell," he said. "Yeah," I said. He walked under the overhang and looked up. "They built this while you were gone." "Apparently." He let out a low whistle. That is bold. Bold was one word for it. There were others, but I was trying to be civilized. That night I sat at my kitchen table and started reading city zoning rules. Setbacks, encroachments, permits, projecting structures, all the thrilling bedtime material a man never thinks he'll need until somebody pours concrete into his life. By the next morning, I was on the phone with the city building department. A woman named Carol answered. Calm voice, the kind that told me she'd heard every version of neighbor nonsense there was. I explained the situation. She asked for photos. I emailed them. 10 minutes later, she called back and said, "Sir, that appears to be a structural encroachment." That was the first time I heard the phrase, but I loved the sound of it. Structural encroachment. Real official. Real bad for them. She asked if I had a survey. I sent that too. Then she said, "We'll send an inspector out." 3 days later, a city truck pulled up behind the Carter house. The inspector, Mike, was a solid guy, mid-50s, maybe clipboard in hand, no nonsense. We walked the line together while he measured the post, measured the overhang, checked the markers, then looked up at the balcony and asked, "Did they even file a permit for this?" I told him I didn't know. He gave this little nod and said, "We're about to find out." Then he walked next door and knocked. From my yard, I watched Travis open the door, spot the city truck, and lose that easy grin he liked to wear. They talked for maybe 10 minutes. I couldn't hear them, but I could see Mike pointing at the post, then at the balcony, then flipping through paperwork. Finally, he pulled a bright orange notice out of his folder and taped it right onto the sliding door that opened to the balcony. Even from where I stood, I could read it. Violation notice. Work ordered halted. That afternoon, Travis came to my front door, and let me tell you, he did not have balcony energy anymore. "You called the city," he said. I leaned against the frame and said, "Yeah." He exhaled hard. "You could have talked to me first." I almost laughed. I did. He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "This is a minor encroachment. 2 feet of concrete in my yard isn't minor. It's just a post. It's my property." That's when Lindsay stepped up behind him and took over, smooth voice, measured tone, trying to make herself the reasonable one. She said, "Look, we're neighbors. We don't want this to become a big thing." I said, "Then move the balcony." She gave me this thin little smile and said, "That would require redesigning the roof line." And there it was. The truth. Money, time, convenience. They built it the easiest way for them and rolled the dice on me not fighting back. Then she tried again. "Maybe we can work something out." "Like what?" "We could maintain the tree for you. Professionally." I stared at her. "You already maintained it." Her smile twitched. Travis jumped back in and said, "Listen, man, it's just airspace. It's not like we're using your yard." I looked up at that balcony and then back at him. From up there, you can see directly into my house, my deck, my office, my bedroom. You realize that, right? He shrugged and said, "So can half the neighborhood." No, I said real calm. They can't. That was the last real conversation we had for a while. The orange notice stayed on their door. Workers showed up twice, looked things over, measured, left. Every day I walked into my backyard and saw that thing hanging over me like a bad thought that wouldn't go away. Then about 3 weeks later, Carol called me back. She said, "The review is finished." I sat down at my kitchen table and said, "All right." She shuffled some papers and said, "The balcony was never permitted as a projecting deck, and the support posts are located 28 inches inside your property line. Not near it, not questionable, 28 inches. Then she said the part Travis definitely didn't expect. They had 30 days to correct the violation, which meant remove the structure or rebuild it so it complied with setback rules. In plain English, the balcony had to come down. When I hung up, I walked outside and looked at it again. Same long shadow on my grass, same chopped branches on the maple, same ugly overhang. But I felt different. Calm, finally. Because it wasn't me versus them anymore. It was them versus the truth on paper. The weirdest part of the whole thing wasn't the blow-up. It was the waiting. 30 days of silence. Travis and Lindsay barely looked at me. No more fence talk, no more fake smiles. One afternoon, Travis stopped by while I was raking leaves, stayed on his side of the fence this time, and said, "You're really going to make us tear that down." I rested both hands on the rake and said I didn't make that decision. "You called the city. You built on my property." He shook his head and said, "It's 2 feet. It's my 2 feet." He stared at the ground for a second and asked, "Do you know what this is going to cost?" I said, "You should have thought about that before you poured concrete in my yard." He looked like he wanted to say a lot more, but he didn't. He just turned and walked away. Day 32 rolled around on a Monday morning and I heard trucks again. Only this time they weren't bringing materials in. They were hauling them out. 3 workers climbed up there with crowbars and drills, and I watched from my kitchen window with a mug of coffee in my hand while they started pulling the thing apart. First, the railing came off metal brackets, popping loose one by one. Then the deck boards, each one pried up with that sharp cracking sound that says somebody's expensive mistake is being undone in public. By the afternoon, half the platform was gone. Travis stood in his yard watching it happen, hands on his hips, face tight, saying nothing. I went outside and sat under the maple tree just to listen. And I'll tell you something honest. There is a deep, almost embarrassing kind of satisfaction in hearing a problem get dismantled piece by piece. The next day they removed the beams, thick supports that had been holding that whole mess out over my yard. By day 3 they got to the posts, and those were the hardest part. Concrete anchors deep in the ground, shovels, jackhammer sweat chunks of broken base hauled out in buckets. I stood there when they pulled the final post free, and for the first time in over a month there was nothing over my backyard but open sky. The foreman walked over afterward, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said, "Sorry you had to deal with that." I told him I appreciate you fixing it. He gave this dry little laugh and said, "Wasn't our design." By the end of the day, the hole was filled with fresh soil and grass seed, like the ground itself was trying to forget the whole thing ever happened. A couple weeks later, they started building again, but this time the balcony was smaller, fully inside their property line, and angled away from my yard so hard it looked like it had learned a moral lesson. I saw Travis out there once while they were finishing it. He noticed me, then looked away like eye contact was suddenly too expensive. We never really spoke after that. Not openly hostile, just distant. And honestly, that suited me fine. My backyard went back to what it had been before quiet private mine. Summer evenings under the maple felt normal again, and after all, that normal felt like a luxury. What I learned from that mess is something I wish wasn't true, but it is. Some people believe the rules are flexible right up until the rules cost them money. They call it a misunderstanding, a small issue, a minor thing, right up until somebody with a clipboard and a city seal tells them otherwise. Then suddenly they want to talk like neighbors again. So I'll ask you this. If you came home and found part of your neighbor's house hanging over your yard, would you have tried to settle it quietly, or would you have called the city the minute you saw it? And where do you draw that line between keeping the peace and letting somebody walk over you sometimes, literally? Tell me what you think, and if you've ever dealt with a neighbor, an HOA, or anybody else who thought boundaries were optional, I'd really want to hear that story too.